Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode over here on the BDGE Dynasty channel. And what I wanted to talk about today here in this solo video is undervalued wide receivers for those contending teams in your Dynasty fantasy football leagues. I wanted to look at Underdog Fantasy, see where some of these undervalued wide receivers are being drafted in those underdog drafts, because we know that those projections are for the 2024 season. So I wanted to see which of those guys were being drafted much higher than they are being valued in Dynasty leagues to see if there was any value that you could add to your rosters if you are a contending team ready to win a championship here during the 2024 season. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. But first, we have to tuck those shirts in. All right, so the first wide receiver that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Deebo Samuel, the wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. And you look at his current ranking over on Keep Trade Cut, he is being valued as the wide receiver 31 in Dynasty Fantasy Football. But when you look at where he's being drafted for the 2024 season, he is currently the wide receiver 15 over on Underdog Fantasy. So that is a total difference in ADP of 16 slots. We're obviously valuing him much higher in those redraft leagues than we are in those Dynasty leagues, but that does tell us that the production that we expect Deebo Samuel to have this year is going to be pretty substantial. Now, obviously, there's a couple of reasons why we are fading Deebo Samuel in Dynasty leagues, and maybe some of them are not that valid, but that does kind of leave him in this range of wide receivers where they're not young, but they're not old either. So it kind of just automatically values him lower in our market. So that is one of the reasons why we are moving him down our board. But also, you look at some of the trade rumors that they have been having over in San Francisco. Obviously, Brandon Ayuk is in a lot of these trade rumors, but also Deebo Samuel has been thrown in some of these trade rumors as well. So that does make this situation here in San Fran a little bit more murky for Dynasty Fantasy Football purposes. However, with that being said, I do expect Deebo Samuel to play football for the San Francisco 49ers this year. And when you start looking at the production that Deebo Samuel has given us over the last couple of seasons, you'll start to see that he is a value for those contending rosters. Now, Deebo Samuel, he's never really been a target hog in this offense. In fact, nobody in this offense really is. You have guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle. All of these guys are going to get their touches, but Deebo Samuel is hyper efficient when he has the football in his hands. I mean, you look at what he was able to do last year. He was a top 15 wide receiver in red zone targets, yards after the catch, total touchdowns, yards per route run, target separation, and juke rate, which did lead him to having a 2023 season where he averaged 16.3 fantasy points per game, which was good for the 12th best in the NFL. Now, there's obviously going to be some inconsistency to Deebo Samuel when you're plugging him in your lineup, just like there is with all of these San Francisco 49er options. But Deebo Samuel, currently being valued as the wide receiver 30 on Keep Trade Cut in that trade market, does make him a value for those contending rosters because you're going to be able to buy him as a wide receiver 2, maybe even a wide receiver 3 in your league market. And when you plug him into your lineup, he's going to be giving you those wide receiver 2, maybe even wide receiver 1 weeks from time to time when you do play him and you are gaining those fantasy football points from him. Now, moving on to our second guy here, we are going to talk about Davante Adams, wide receiver for the Las Vegas Raiders, and his current KTC rank is the wide receiver 35. You look at his underdog fantasy rank, and he's being drafted as the wide receiver 13 over there for the 2024 season. So that is a total ADP difference of about 22 spots. Obviously, the reason why we are pushing him down our rankings in Dynasty Fantasy Football is that age, because he's going to be 32 years old later this year. But with that being said, he has still given us some elite production, even last year in 2023 for the Las Vegas Raiders. I mean, you look at some of the quarterback woes that he had to kind of get over in 2023. Aiden O'Connell, Jimmy Garoppolo, not the greatest of quarterback play for Davante Adams here in Las Vegas. But even with that bad quarterback play, he did post 103 receptions for 1,144 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, which had him averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game. And I get it, at 32 years old, you're most likely not looking to buy Davante Adams. You're probably more likely looking to sell him. But if you are a contender, you can argue that there's never been a cheaper price for Davante Adams. And you could even argue that he's gotten a quarterback upgrade going into the 2024 season with Gardner Minshew under center. Now, the Las Vegas Raiders, they've lacked receiving options there in Las Vegas for a long time. Obviously, Brock Bowers was drafted to them earlier this summer, but in 2023, Adams saw 175 receiving targets, which is an average of 10.3 targets per game. This was the second best in the NFL. On top of that, Adams also posted the 8th best dominator rating as well. Now, there are some minor yellow flags as you dig a little bit deeper into Davante Adams' profile, the biggest one being that we saw some regression in the efficiency numbers, and more specifically, target separation, average cushion, and yards after the catch. And this is probably due to him getting a little bit older and that age kind of catching up to Davante Adams. However, in most of your leagues, you can probably go add Davante Adams for a future second round pick. And if that's the cost of acquisition, he is still going to be one of the most targeted wide receivers in fantasy football this year, making him a value, especially in those PPR leagues where you are a contending team. Now, moving on to our next guy, we are going to talk about Mike Evans, wide receiver for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and his current KTC ranking is the wide receiver 33, but he's being drafted as the wide receiver 17 on Underdog Fantasy, giving you a 16-point difference in his ADPs. And it feels like the fantasy football community just never learns their lesson when it comes to Mike Evans. Year after year, he continues to outperform his ADP. He gives us top-end production. We get those wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 numbers. And then every single year, we just go back to fading him down our rankings for whatever reasons it may be. And it's no different this year. We're doing the same thing with Mike Evans. Last year, Mike Evans posted 79 receptions for 1,255 receiving yards and 13 touchdowns. This averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game, which was the 10th best in the NFL. And now, due to him being 30 years old, everybody is naturally fading him again down their draft board. And because of that, we can now get him outside of our top 30 wide receivers in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now, Evans hasn't necessarily shown us any signs of slowing down. I mean, you look at what the Buccaneers did this offseason. They gave him new money. They gave Baker Mayfield new money. Obviously, Dave Canales has left town, and that's going to be a question that they have to figure out. But if you do believe that Mike Evans and Baker Mayfield have gotten some rapport and they built on that, what they did here in 2023, you probably have to also believe that Mike Evans is going to continue to be the focal point of this passing offense. And because of that, he's most likely going to post his 11th 1,000-yard season in a row. So you can choose to continue fading Mike Evans, and you can kind of push him outside of your Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. But for those of you that want to win a championship, just like Deebo Samuel, you can add him to your roster outside of that top 30, and he's probably going to give you some wide receiver 1 weeks, most likely wide receiver 2 weeks for the majority of the season, and he can help you go get that trophy. Now, moving on to the fourth wide receiver here, we are going to talk about Stefon Diggs, the new wide receiver for the Houston Texans, and his current KTC ranking is the wide receiver 42. His underdog ranking right now is wide receiver 20, so that is a 22-point ADP difference between the two platforms. Now, the narrative surrounding Stefon Diggs hasn't necessarily been great this offseason. This is a guy who turned 30 years old. He's also had a little bit of drama off of the field, especially on the internet when you're talking about him tweeting away and doing all of that stuff. And because of that, he also got himself traded from the Buffalo Bills to the Houston Texans, which is now a more crowded wide receiver room. And it kind of gives you that icky feeling because now he's not going to be a target volume kind of guy. And he did decline a little bit. At least he didn't perform for us down the stretch last year when he was a target volume guy. Now, because of all of these things, it does seem like Stefon Diggs has fallen outside of the top 40 wide receivers over on Keep Trade Cut. But I do think that the pendulum has swung a little bit too far on this because you look at what Stefon Diggs did for us last year from a statistical standpoint. He had 107 receptions for 1,183 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, and he still averaged 16.1 fantasy points per game, which was good for the 13th overall wide receiver. Now, obviously, like we mentioned earlier before, this is a different situation, so it's kind of hard to imagine what this is going to look like here in Houston with Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stefon Diggs. But I also think it's kind of hard to imagine that the Houston Texans, who are going to be in a contending window, make a trade like this for a receiver that's going to demand that type of volume, and they don't get him involved. It just feels like they're going to be getting him involved this year. And the way that I see it right now, it does seem like Stefon Diggs kind of profiles as that underneath wide receiver. You do have Nico Collins as a big play guy on the outside, and you also have Tank Dell as a deep threat on the outside. But Diggs profiles better as that slot, and it does seem like he's going to be that underneath option, kind of that safety net for CJ Stroud, and I think that role in itself is probably going to demand at least about 100 targets. So even if Diggs does take a step back from those high-end wide receiver 1 numbers that we saw him posting there in Buffalo, I still think that Diggs can be a safe wide receiver 2 here in Houston, and he can probably give you wide receiver 1 spike weeks, similar to guys like Michael Pittman Jr. and Brandon Ayuk. Now, moving on to our next wide receiver here, I do want to talk about Cooper Kupp, wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams, and currently his Keep Trade Cut ranking is the wide receiver 37, but on Underdog Fantasy, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 23. So that is a 14-spot difference in his ADPs. Now, Cooper Kupp's 2023 season was obviously very disappointing for fantasy football managers because he did have back-to-back wide receiver 1 overall finishes in 2021 and in 2022, but if you drafted him in 2023, he definitely did not perform like that for your fantasy football rosters. Now, with that being said, I don't think all of that was on Cooper Kupp. You look at what he was dealing with to start the season, a hamstring injury and an ankle sprain that did have him miss some time at the beginning of the season. And along with missing that time, we also saw the emergence of Puka Nacua, who did kind of take a big step in this offense and take a big role in this offense for the majority of the year. Now, over on my channel at the League FFB, I did a running back version of this exact episode. So if you do want to check that out, you can go check that out. But in that episode, I talk about how with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, typically in the Dynasty fantasy football community, when we have a young guy that we like, we tend to boost them up. And because of that, we also tend to fade the veterans that are around them as well. I think this is also happening with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. I think we're fading Cooper Kupp to boost Puka Nacua in our rankings. Now, down the stretch last year, from weeks 11 to 17, the split between the two guys was damn near 50-50. In fact, Cooper Kupp saw 49 targets and Puka saw 50 in this time period. And not only that, but 5 out of the 6 games in that stretch, Cooper Kupp still had double-digit fantasy finishes in each of those games, and he was also a top 5 wide receiver in 2 of those 6 games, showing that he still has wide receiver 1 upside despite Puka Nacua breaking out in this offense. So we can say that it's Puka Nacua's team all you want. In fact, I might even agree with you there, but Kupp is still a real separator on this offense. He still has a top 20 target share, and he has massive red zone opportunities, and that in itself makes him a value at the wide receiver position, especially for your contending teams. Now, moving on to our second to last guy, I want to talk about Amari Cooper, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. And you look at his KTC ranking right now, he is the wide receiver 41 over there, but on Underdog Fantasy, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 29, which gives you about a 12-point difference in the ADPs. And it seems like the stench of Deshaun Watson and the stench of the Cleveland Browns has kind of spread so far that now it is affecting Amari Cooper. And this is despite the fact that Amari Cooper still posted 72 receptions for 1,250 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns in 2023 while dealing with a QB carousel of guys throwing him the football. To summarize who he played with, Cooper played with Deshaun Watson, Joe Flacco, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, PJ Walker, and Jeff Driscoll last year, and he still averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game and finished as the wide receiver 20 overall. Now, Amari has been a wide receiver who has finished in the top 25 every single season of his entire career, aside from 2017, where he finished as the wide receiver 31, but he's currently being valued as the wide receiver 41 in Dynasty Fantasy Football, and that puts him in the same tier of guys like Marquise Brown, Jalen Polk, and Jameson Williams. And despite never really being a major red zone threat or never posting high-end touchdown numbers, Cooper still seems to dominate target share and air yard shares with consistent production, and this just keeps making him an unappealing but an effective wide receiver 2 or 3 for our fantasy football teams. And now the last and final player that I want to talk about is going to be Keenan Allen, the new wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. And you look at where he's being valued on Keep Trade Cut, currently the wide receiver 53, and you look at his underdog ranking, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 32. So we see a total difference in those ADPs of about 21 spots. And Keenan Allen finds himself as the most affordable option here on this list today because he kind of has a higher age like Davante Adams, and he has now found himself in a murkier wide receiver room similar to Stefon Diggs because earlier this offseason, the Los Angeles Chargers, they traded Keenan Allen to the Chicago Bears to save some room on some cap space and start a new era of the Los Angeles Chargers under new head coach Jim Harbaugh. Now, this trade shouldn't really be an indictment on Keenan Allen because when you look at what he was able to do for our fantasy football teams in 2023, Allen posted 108 receptions for 1,243 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. And while he did this, he was averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game, which was good for the 3rd best in the NFL. Now, I get it. Those days, they might be behind us, and I do think that it's probably the safer bet to say that Keenan Allen does take a step forward, but he does clearly have a little bit of juice and a little bit of gas left in the tank here for our fantasy football rosters. And even though this move to Chicago, pairing him with DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet, and Caleb Williams probably will affect the target share that Keenan Allen is used to seeing, Keenan Allen has still shown us that he can still be efficient with his touches because in 2023, he posted top 12 numbers in yards per route run, dominator rating, juke rate, and fantasy points per route run. So even if Keenan Allen does go into this offense, he does become the number 2 option for a year behind DJ Moore. I still think he can give us some wide receiver 2 weeks, and at worst probably just give us some wide receiver 3 numbers where we can throw him in as a flex on our contending teams. And even at that, he's still going to be a value because like I mentioned, he's being valued outside of those top 50 wide receivers in Dynasty leagues, so you can probably get him for pretty cheap. Now that is all I have for you guys today, so if you did enjoy the video, and if you do want to see that running back version of this video, it is going to be over on my channel at the League FFB. Just look for this thumbnail right here. You guys will see it over here, so go check that out. And while you're at it, also make sure you like and subscribe to this channel right here because more Dynasty Fantasy Football content will be coming your way, group videos, solo videos, and also redraft content here very soon over on the redraft channel. So make sure you're tapped into both of those. But with all all of that being said, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.